I want to be precise about what I noticed in the order I noticed it, because the order is the only thing I still trust. I bought the unit in the late autumn of what the closing documents call the third quarter of that year. It was a one-bedroom on the 4th floor of a 6-story building, a converted municipal structure that had been a records annex for the city before private developers took the upper floors and turned them into what the listing called boutique residences. The lower 2 floors were still leased back to the city for archival storage. I never went down there. The elevator didn't stop on those floors without a key card, and I had no reason to ask for one. I worked in IT compliance for a mid-sized insurance broker, and my life was small and orderly in the way I preferred it. I cooked at home. I went to the gym in the basement. I slept 7 hours, and on weekends, I read in the chair by the window. That's the texture I want to establish first. Nothing about my life was open to interpretation. The first thing I noticed, about 3 weeks after I moved in, was a sound above the bedroom ceiling that I described to myself as the building settling. It wasn't continuous. It happened in the early morning between 4:50 and 5:10, and it sounded like a slow weight being redistributed, not footsteps. More like someone shifting their hips while lying down. I want to be careful here because I know how that sounds. I told myself it was the HVAC, because the HVAC for the 4th floor units was housed in the crawl space that ran along the entire ceiling of our floor. The building manager, a man named Devereaux, who worked out of a small office on the 2nd floor, confirmed this when I emailed him. He said the air handlers cycled in pre-dawn intervals to take advantage of off-peak power rates, and that the noise was normal, and that no one had complained about it before. I accepted that. I want to underline that. I accepted it. I am not someone who looks for trouble in his own home. I bought a white noise machine. I moved the head of my bed to the opposite wall, and I stopped hearing it for almost 4 months. When I started hearing it again, it was not in the same place. The shifting weight had moved from above the bed to above the hallway, just outside the bedroom door. I noticed because I was up late, finishing a compliance audit, and I heard the sound directly above me as I walked from the kitchen to the bathroom at around 2 in the morning. I stopped in the hallway and listened, and the sound stopped too. Not immediately. There was a delay of maybe 3 seconds, the kind of delay you get when someone realizes they've been heard and decides to stay still. I stood there for almost 4 minutes. The sound did not resume while I was standing. When I went back to the kitchen and ran the tap, it started again. I told myself it was a rodent. The building was old. The crawl space was long. I emailed Devereaux a second time and asked if pest control had been through recently. He replied within an hour, which was unusual for him, and said that the building was on a quarterly contract with a company called Lindring Environmental, and that the most recent inspection of the 4th floor crawl space had been completed 11 days ago with no findings. He attached the report. The report was a single page, signed by a technician whose name was printed but whose signature was a flat line, as if the pen hadn't been pressed down. The inspection time was listed as 14 minutes, The fourth floor crawl space, according to the building's own original blueprints, which I later pulled from the city's public records portal, ran the length of 7 units. 14 minutes for 7 units of crawl space, including ingress and egress, through a locked access hatch at the end of the hall, struck me as fast. Not impossible, just fast. I filed that observation away. I did not act on it. What changed my behavior was the smell. About 2 weeks after the second sound began, I started noticing a faint odor in the bedroom that I could only describe as warm fabric. Not unwashed, not sour, not anything alarming. It smelled like a person who had been wearing the same clothes for a long time in a heated room. It was strongest near the closet, which shared a wall with the hallway, which sat directly under the section of crawl space where the sound had relocated. The smell came and went on no schedule I could identify. I bought an air quality monitor, the kind that logs particulate counts and VOCs to an app on your phone, and I left it running on the dresser for a full week. The data was, on its face, normal. Particulates within range, VOCs within range, humidity within range, but there was a pattern in the temperature graph that I didn't notice until I exported the raw CSV and looked at it on my work laptop. The bedroom temperature, which the thermostat held at 68 degrees, had a recurring spike of about 1.5 degrees that occurred between 4:40 and 5:15 every morning. Every single morning. The spike was not large enough to trigger the HVAC. It just registered, peaked, and faded. When I overlaid the spike against the timestamps of the original sound I had logged in my phone notes, they aligned within a margin of 2 minutes. Heat rises. The bedroom ceiling shared its thermal envelope with the crawl space above it. If something warm was up there, between 4:40 and 5:15, my room would record exactly the curve I was seeing. I want to say clearly that at this point, I still did not believe a person was living above my ceiling. The idea was, on its surface, absurd. The crawl space, according to the blueprints, was 31 inches tall at its highest point and tapered to 22 inches near the exterior wall. It contained ductwork, electrical conduit, and a fire suppression line. There was no plumbing up there, no insulation thick enough to muffle a body, and no documented access except for the single hatch at the end of the hallway, which was secured with a building-issued padlock. I had walked past that hatch every day since I moved in. The padlock had never looked disturbed. I tell you all of this so you understand that I exhausted the reasonable explanations before I went any further. The escalation, when it came, was administrative. I requested a copy of the building's full maintenance log through a tenant portal that the management company maintained. I was within my rights to do so as a unit owner. The log covered the previous 6 years and was organized by floor and by work order number. I searched for crawl space, hatch, access, and 4th floor ceiling. I found 17 entries. Most were routine, filter changes, duct cleaning, 2 instances of repairing a fire suppression valve. But 3 of the entries were strange. They were labeled occupancy verification, and they were filed by a contractor I had never heard of, whose name appeared nowhere else in the log. The entries were brief. Each one read in the description field, verified, no change, resealed. The dates were spaced roughly 20 months apart, going back almost 6 years. The most recent one was filed 3 days before I closed on the unit. I reread that entry several times. Verified. No change. Resealed. I emailed Devereaux and asked him what an occupancy verification was and which contractor performed them and what was being verified. He did not reply that day. He did not reply the next day. On the third day, I received a reply not from him but from a generic management address, signed only Building Operations, informing me that the entries I had referenced were administrative placeholders related to structural envelope monitoring and were not relevant to tenant concerns. The reply suggested that if I had a specific maintenance issue, I should submit a ticket through the standard portal. Structural envelope monitoring is a real term. It refers to inspections of a building's exterior shell for moisture, air leakage, and thermal performance. It is not normally conducted from inside an interior crawl space, and it is not normally described as occupancy verification. I noticed when I went back to the maintenance log to screenshot the entries for my records that one of them was no longer there. The second most recent occupancy verification, the one dated roughly 20 months before my closing, had been removed. The work order numbers around it had been renumbered to close the gap. I had not screenshotted the original list. I had no proof that the entry had ever existed. But I remembered the date because it was my mother's birthday, and I had paused on it when I first read the log. I started keeping screenshots of everything after that. The next thing I want to describe is the hatch. The Crawlspace access hatch sat at the end of the 4th floor hallway, set into the ceiling above a small alcove that also contained the fire extinguisher cabinet and the floor's electrical panel. The hatch was a standard square panel, painted the same off-white as the ceiling, with a recessed pull ring and a hasp secured by a brass padlock. I had walked past it, as I said, every day. I began to photograph it every day with my phone at roughly the same time each evening when I came home from the gym. For the first 11 days, the photographs were identical. The hatch was closed, the padlock was secured, the paint was uniform. On the 12th day, the padlock was on the opposite side of the hasp. The hasp itself had not moved. The lock had simply been threaded through from the other direction. This is the kind of detail that does not register if you are not looking for it. I would not have noticed if I had not been comparing the photos side by side on my laptop. The shackle of the lock entered the hasp from the right in every previous photo. On the 12th day, it entered from the left. On the 13th day, it was back on the right. I considered that I might be misreading the angles. I went to the hallway with a tape measure and a notebook and stood under the hatch and noted the exact orientation of the lock. Right side, shackle entering from the right. Body of the lock facing the wall. I photographed it again. The next morning before I left for work, I photographed it once more. It was identical. That evening at 6:14, I photographed it again. The body of the lock was now facing the hallway. The shackle was entering from the right, but the lock had been rotated 180 degrees on its own axis. I want to be clear about what this implied. The padlock could only be rotated if it was first removed. The hasp went through the shackle in a way that physically prevented rotation while engaged. To rotate the lock, someone had to unlock it, lift it free, turn it, and relock it. Between 8 in the morning and 6:14 in the evening while I was at work, someone with a key had done that. I did not call anyone that night. I want to explain why. The only people with keys to that lock, in theory, were building management and the contractor referenced in the maintenance log. If I called the police, I would be calling them to report that a padlock in a common hallway had been rotated. They would reasonably ask if anything had been damaged or stolen, and I would have to say no. And they would reasonably leave. If I called Devereaux, I would be telling the only person who had institutional authority over the hatch that I was watching the hatch. I had already gotten the sense from the deflected reply about occupancy verification that watching the hatch was not something the building wanted me to do, so I watched it more carefully instead. Over the next month, I logged 41 photographs of the hatch. The padlock changed orientation 7 times. The hatch itself, the panel, never appeared to move. The paint around the hatch frame, however, developed a series of small inconsistencies that I documented with macro photographs. Tiny chips along the lower edge of the frame on the side nearest the wall, faint scuffing on the recessed pull ring, a single hair, dark about 4 inches long, caught in the seam on the night of what I think was the 23rd or 24th photograph. I did not touch the hair. I photographed it from 3 angles and went back to my unit. When I checked the next morning, the hair was gone. There was no cleaning crew scheduled for that hallway on that day. I checked the building's posted cleaning schedule, which was taped inside the elevator. The 4th floor common areas were cleaned on Tuesdays and Fridays. The hair appeared and disappeared on a Wednesday. The cleaning schedule, when I looked at it again 2 weeks later, said the 4th floor was cleaned on Mondays and Thursdays. I had taken a photograph of the original schedule because by that point I was photographing everything. I compared them. The font was the same, the letterhead was the same, the paper looked the same. But the days had changed, and the schedule was not labeled as updated, and there was no notice posted anywhere about the change. I started noticing other small revisions. The fire evacuation map mounted next to the elevator on the 4th floor showed the crawlspace hatch as a labeled feature, mechanical access, with a small icon. On a Tuesday in early spring, the icon was gone. The map otherwise appeared identical. 2 days later, the icon was back, but it had moved about 3 inches along the hallway, closer to the elevator. The actual hatch had not moved. The map had. I want to describe the feeling of noticing these things because I think it is important. It was not fear, not yet. It was the particular discomfort of realizing that the documentation around you is not stable. When a map is wrong, you assume the map is wrong. When the map keeps changing to match nothing, you start to wonder what the map is for. In late spring, I did something I had been avoiding. I requested through the city's public records portal the original architectural drawings for the building including all post-conversion modifications. The records came back in 2 batches. The first batch, the original municipal annex plans, showed the crawl space as a single, continuous void running the length of the 4th floor, with one access hatch at the east end of the hallway. The second batch, the post-conversion modifications filed by the developer, showed the same crawl space but with an additional feature I had not seen on any building-provided document. There was a second access point. It was labeled Interior Service Penetration, and it was located in the ceiling of Unit 4 Echo F. Unit 4F, according to the building's posted directory, did not exist. The 4th floor had units 4A through 4E and then 4G. There was no 4F. I walked the hallway that evening and counted the doors. 5 doors lettered A through E, then a stretch of blank wall about 10 feet long, then door G at the end. The blank wall was where, on the post-conversion plans, Unit 4F should have been. The wall had no door, no seam, no outlet, no light switch. It was, as far as I could tell, simply wall. I stood in front of it for a long time. I knocked on it. It sounded like wall. I went back to my unit, pulled up the plans on my laptop, and measured the dimensions of Unit 4F as drawn. It was small, much smaller than the other units. It was listed at 140 square feet. It had no kitchen. It had no bathroom. It had a single space marked habitation and a smaller space marked vertical access, which connected by a stair symbol directly to the crawl space above. I want to say plainly that at this point I understood something that I had been refusing to understand for months. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in bed with the white noise machine off, listening for the shifting weight, and at 4:53 in the morning I heard it. It was not above me anymore. It had moved again. It was now above the wall behind the headboard, the wall that, if you traced it through the building, ran directly to the blank stretch of hallway where Unit 4F was drawn but did not visibly exist. The next morning I called a structural engineer, not the building's, a private one, recommended by a colleague at work. I told him I wanted a non-invasive assessment of a wall section in a common area of my building, and that I was willing to pay out of pocket. He said he could do it on a Saturday, using a thermal camera and a stud finder, and that it would not take long. I scheduled it for the following Saturday. On Friday evening, I received an email from building operations. It informed me that due to scheduled maintenance, the 4th floor hallway would be inaccessible to non-residents on Saturday between the hours of 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. The email did not specify the nature of the maintenance. It did not list a contractor. It was signed only Building Operations. I had not told anyone, not Devereux, not the management company, not anyone in the building, that I had hired an engineer for Saturday. I had scheduled the appointment by phone from inside my own apartment on a personal cell phone. The engineer's company had no relationship with the building. I did not cancel the appointment. I called the engineer and asked him to come on Sunday instead. He agreed. I did not mention the email. On Sunday morning, the hallway was open. The engineer arrived at 10. He was a quiet man in his 50s, methodical. the kind of professional who did not ask why I wanted what I wanted. I stood with him in the hallway while he ran the thermal camera along the blank stretch of wall. I watched the screen over his shoulder. The wall on the camera was not uniform. There was a clear thermal differential about 3 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall, centered roughly where the Unit 4F door would have been on the plans. The differential was warmer than the surrounding wall by about 2 degrees. The shape of it was rectangular. The edges were sharp. He moved the camera up toward the ceiling and traced along the seam. The thermal pattern continued upward into the crawl space and faded. He lowered the camera and looked at me. He said, "There's a cavity behind this. The framing isn't continuous." He paused and then he said, "And there's a heat source. Steady, it's not ductwork." I asked him what it could be. He said, "Could be a lot of things. Could be a leaking hot water line, but there shouldn't be one here. Could be electrical, could be a person." He said it the way an engineer says a thing, without weight, as one item on a list. I asked him to put it in his report. He said he would. His report arrived by email on Tuesday. It was 3 pages. It described the thermal anomaly, the framing inconsistency, and a recommendation that the building's management be contacted for further investigation. I printed it. I saved it to 2 separate cloud accounts. I emailed a copy to my own personal address from my work address. I wanted, if anything happened to my devices, for the document to exist somewhere I could not be locked out of. On Wednesday morning, I received a call from Devereaux. He was friendly. He said the building had been notified of an unauthorized contractor inspection in the hallway over the weekend, and he wanted to remind me that any work in common areas needed to be cleared through management. I asked him how he'd been notified. He said the cameras in the hallway had flagged it. I had not seen any cameras in the 4th floor hallway. I had walked that hallway hundreds of times, and the only cameras in the building, as far as I knew, were in the lobby, the elevator, the gym, and the parking garage. I asked him casually where the 4th floor camera was located. He paused and then he said, "I'll have to check. I think it was added recently." I went to the hallway after I hung up. I walked the length of it slowly, looking up. There was a small dark dome, about the size of a golf ball, mounted in the ceiling near the elevator. It had not been there before. I had photographs from the previous month showing the same stretch of ceiling, and the dome was not in any of them. The cameras had been added recently, or the cameras had always been there, and the ceiling around them had been adjusted to hide them. Or the ceiling had been adjusted to show them now, after I had become a problem. I did not know which. I could not know which. The point, I think, was that I could not know. I started taking notes on paper. I did not trust the cloud anymore. I bought a small notebook and a pen, and I wrote down, by hand, every observation I could remember, in chronological order, with timestamps where I had them. I kept the notebook in a locked drawer at my office, not in my apartment. I did not photograph it. I did not type it. I treated it as the only artifact I controlled. The night after I bought the notebook, I dreamed about the hatch. I am only mentioning this because the dream was not a dream in the usual sense. It was simple and specific. I was lying in my bed and I could hear, very clearly, someone above me turning the pages of a book. The pages turned at regular intervals about every 40 seconds. I counted 12 pages before I woke up. When I woke, the bedroom was silent, but the air quality monitor showed a temperature spike that had begun at 4:41 and was just now fading. The spike had lasted exactly the length of 12 pages, turning at 40-second intervals. 8 minutes. I want to be careful with this detail because I do not want to overstate it. The math could be coincidence. But I had been logging these spikes for months, and the spikes had always been short and shallow. This one was longer and warmer than any I had recorded. It was in the data, an outlier. In the same week, I noticed that my mail had begun to arrive opened. Not all of it, just specific pieces, bank statements, the tax assessment for the unit, a letter from my employer's HR department. The envelopes were not torn. They had been slit cleanly along the top edge, the kind of cut you make with a letter opener, and then placed in my mailbox. The mailbox itself was in the lobby, behind a brass door, secured by a small key that I kept on my main key ring. There was no sign of forced entry. The lock turned normally. I called the post office. They had no record of any mail being processed irregularly. They suggested I file a report with the building. I did not. Instead, I started picking up my mail at a P.O. box across town. For about 3 weeks after that, things were quiet. The sounds above the bedroom continued, but they were faint, and they did not move. The padlock on the hatch did not change orientation. The blank wall in the hallway did not change. The cleaning schedule did not change. I started to think, against my better judgment, that whatever had been happening had stopped. That whoever was watching or living or doing whatever was being done above and around me had decided that I was too attentive to be useful and had moved on. I was wrong about that. What had actually happened, as far as I can reconstruct, is that the system had decided to correct me instead of evading me. The first sign of the correction was small. I came home from work on a Thursday and my apartment number on my own door was wrong. The number had been 4C since I moved in. On that Thursday, the brass numeral on the door read 4B. The neighbor's door, which had been 4B, now read 4C. I checked my keys. They worked in the door labeled 4B, which was my apartment, which had all of my furniture in it, which was unmistakably my home. I walked down to the lobby. The directory had been updated. My name was now listed next to 4B. The name that had been next to 4B, a woman named Halberg, whom I had nodded to in the elevator, perhaps a dozen times, was now next to 4C. I knocked on 4C. Halberg answered. I said as casually as I could that I thought our unit numbers had been switched. She looked at me for a long moment and then she said, "They were always like this." She did not look confused. She did not look amused. She looked, if anything, slightly sorry for me. I went back to my apartment, which was now 4B, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I pulled up my closing documents on my laptop. The deed listed my unit as 4B. The tax records listed my unit as 4B. The building's online tenant portal listed my unit as 4B. Everything, every digital record I could find, said that my unit had always been 4B. I went to my paper notebook, the one in the locked drawer at my office the next morning. The first entry, written in my own handwriting 9 months earlier, said moved into 4C. I had written it. I remembered writing it. The pen ink was the same blue I had been using for the entire notebook. The handwriting was mine. I had 2 records. One in my own hand on paper in a drawer I controlled. One in every other system, every database, every document I could access. They disagreed. I want to describe what it feels like to hold those 2 records in your hands at the same time. It is not a feeling of fear exactly. It is closer to a kind of vertigo. You understand at a level below thought that one of these 2 records is a lie. You cannot tell which. You believe, because you have to believe, that your own handwriting in your own private notebook is the truth. But the rest of the world, every form, every official, every digital trace is telling you something else. And the rest of the world is much larger than you are. I started around this time to question other small things. I would look at a photograph on my phone, a photo I had taken of the hatch or the hallway map, and I would not be sure if the photo had always looked the way it did. I had screenshots, but I did not always remember taking them. I had notes, but the notes referred to events that the digital record now contradicted. I began to feel that the boundary between what I had observed and what I had been allowed to observe was thinner than I had assumed. I took a week of vacation from work. I did not go anywhere. I stayed in the apartment that was now 4B, but had once been 4C, and I watched. On the second night of that week, at 3:12 in the morning, I heard the hatch open. It was not above my bedroom. It was at the end of the hallway. I heard the soft metallic click of the padlock, the small creak of the panel hinging down, and then a long silence. I was lying in bed with the door to my apartment locked and chained. I did not move. I did not turn on a light. I listened. For about 4 minutes, there was no sound. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were quiet, slow, deliberate. They walked from the end of the hallway past Unit G, past the blank stretch of wall where 4F was drawn, past the unit that had been mine and was now Halberg's, and they stopped outside my door. They stood there for what I think was close to 2 minutes. I could not hear breathing, but I could hear very faintly the rustle of fabric, the sound of someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Then the footsteps walked back. The hatch creaked again. The padlock clicked. Silence. I did not move from the bed for another hour. When I finally got up and went to the door and looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. I checked the deadbolt. It was engaged. I checked the chain. It was engaged. I checked my phone for the time. The phone said 3:58. I pulled up the camera roll to take a picture of the door just to have a record of the time, and I noticed that there were 2 new photographs in the roll that I had not taken. The photographs were of the inside of my apartment. One was of the kitchen, taken from the doorway. One was of the hallway leading to the bedroom, taken from the same angle. They were time-stamped at 3:23 that morning. They had been taken with my phone, which had been on my nightstand, plugged in, screen down, the entire night. I sat on the floor of the hallway and looked at the photographs for a long time. The apartment in the photographs was my apartment. The angle was the angle a person would have if they were standing in the entryway of my unit looking in. The lighting was the dim, ambient light of a living room at night. There was no flash. The photographs were not blurry. They had been taken carefully. I deleted them. Then I went into the deleted items folder and deleted them again. Then I powered off the phone and put it in a kitchen drawer. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked the phone. It had powered itself back on. The photographs were back in the camera roll. They were no longer time-stamped at 3:23. They were now time-stamped at the same minute as my last legitimate photograph 2 days earlier, as if they had always been part of that sequence. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it is important to be honest about this. I did nothing. I did not call the police. I did not call a lawyer. I did not call my family. I did not move out. I did not break the lease. I did not even change the locks, because I had come to understand by then that changing the locks would not matter. Whoever or whatever had access to my apartment had access through systems I could not see and could not modify. The locks were ornamental. The deed was ornamental. The unit number was ornamental. The records were ornamental. I lived inside a structure that had decided long before I arrived what was true about the space I occupied, and my role in that structure was to notice or not notice, and the noticing did not change the structure. I stayed. I want to be clear that I am not proud of this. I am describing it as it happened. I told myself at the time that I was gathering more evidence, that I would eventually have enough to bring to someone who could act on it. But the truth, which I understood even then, was that I had begun to doubt my own ability to identify what was evidence and what was not. The notebook in the drawer at my office was, by then, the only document I trusted. And even the notebook had started to feel uncertain to me. I would read an entry I had written 6 months earlier and not recognize the moment it described, even though the handwriting was mine. I lived in the apartment for another 14 months. During that time, the sounds above the bedroom continued. The temperature spikes continued. The padlock on the hatch continued occasionally to change orientation. The blank stretch of wall remained blank. Halberg and 4C never spoke to me again, though we passed each other in the elevator perhaps 20 times. The cleaning schedule revised itself twice more. The fire evacuation map's hatch icon migrated 3 more times along the corridor. I learned to live with all of it. I learned more accurately to not notice it. I trained myself deliberately to look away from the hatch when I walked past it. I trained myself to ignore the temperature graph on the air quality monitor. I trained myself to stop comparing the cleaning schedule to my photographs. The training worked. After about 6 months, I could walk down the hallway and into my apartment and feel, for stretches of minutes at a time, that I lived in an ordinary building. I sold the unit in the fall of last year. The sale closed quickly. The buyer was a young woman who worked in finance. She asked very few questions during the showing. She did not ask about the building's history. She did not ask about the maintenance log. She did not ask about the crawl space. I considered telling her. I want you to know that I considered it. I did not tell her in the end because I did not know what to tell her that would be useful. If I described what I had observed, she would either not believe me, in which case I would have made myself look unstable, or she would believe me, in which case I would have made her into the next person to live with what I had lived with. Neither outcome seemed like a kindness. I told myself that her experience would be different, that the system, whatever it was, might have moved on, that she might never hear the shifting weight at 4:50 in the morning, or smell the warm fabric, or notice the temperature spike, or count the doors in the hallway. I closed on the sale on a Tuesday. I moved my things into a rented house in a different part of the city. I kept the notebook. I kept the engineer's report. I kept the photographs. About 3 weeks after I moved out, I received, at my new address, a piece of mail. The envelope had no return address. It was the size and shape of a standard business envelope, slit cleanly along the top, the way the opened mail at the old apartment had been slit. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of a maintenance log entry, formatted exactly like the entries I had pulled from the tenant portal years earlier. The work order number was new. The contractor name was the same one that had filed the occupancy verifications. The date was the previous Friday. The description field read, "Verified, no change, resealed." There was nothing else in the envelope. No note, no signature, no explanation. I have not been back to the building. I have not driven past it. I have not looked at the listings to see if Halberg still lives there, or if the young woman who bought my unit still lives there, or if the unit numbers have shifted again. I have deliberately kept my attention away from it. But I check my mail every day. I check it carefully. I look at the seal of every envelope before I open it. I have not received a second printout. I do not know if I will. I do not know what it would mean if I did, and I do not know what it means that I have not. I am writing this down because I want a record outside my own head and outside my own drawers and outside any system that I do not personally control. I am writing it down because the notebook is full now, and because I have started to notice in the rented house that the temperature in the bedroom has begun to spike very slightly between 4:40 and 5:15 in the morning. The spike is small. It is within the margin of error of the sensor. It could be the furnace. It could be the sun coming up. It could be the way the house breathes. I am almost sure that it is one of those things. If anyone reading this has ever found in their own building a unit number on a plan that does not exist in the hallway, or a maintenance entry described as occupancy verification, or an envelope opened cleanly without a return address, I would like to know quietly before I decide what the spike in my new bedroom is.